Imagine lying in a hospital bed, completely paralyzed, unable to lift a single finger, while the woman who wears your engagement ring leans over you and whispers, "Die faster, Jack." My lawyers are waiting. For 18 days, billionaire tech mogul and underground boss Jack Carter lay in that exact room, surrounded by medical monitors and a treasonous conspiracy. His fiancée, his crooked lawyers, and his own stepbrother openly divided his $11 billion empire right before his eyes, treating him like a piece of dead furniture. They thought they were standing over a helpless vegetable. What they didn't know was that Jack's coma was a calculated, brilliant trap. He had anticipated the hit, faked the vegetative state, and turned his own bedroom into a silent hard drive, recording every name, every routing number, and every confession. He wasn't a dying man. He was a loaded gun waiting for the perfect microsecond to pull the trigger on them all. But the biggest shock didn't come from the enemies who wanted him dead. It came from the most invisible person in the house. Welcome to our channel, where we dissect the unseen world of the underground elite. There are men who are born to submit, and there are those who are born to rule. The streets and corporate boardrooms teach you how to survive. But the ultimate lessons, the ones that test the very limits of human willpower, are never taught in a classroom. They are only known by the bosses. This channel does not tell simple stories of senseless crime. We decode the high-level strategy, the unyielding stoicism, and the psychological secrets hidden behind true, raw power. This story is a masterclass in emotional control and tactical patience. It teaches us that in moments of total catastrophe, your ultimate weapon is not anger or immediate retaliation, it is absolute silence. True wisdom is learning to watch what people do when they believe you have nothing left to offer them. It forces us to look past social status, revealing that the walls we build out of money and power are completely hollow, and that genuine loyalty is often found in the people we choose to ignore. If you have the mindset of a leader and want to master the art of strategic thinking, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far this story travels. Share this video with someone who needs to sharpen their armor, and subscribe to the channel. The king is awake, the trap is locked, and what happens next will leave you completely breathless. The master bedroom of the sprawling Carter estate had always been a monument to absolute power. But tonight, it felt like a beautifully gilded tomb. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn tight against the howling Michigan wind, sealing the room in an oppressive, sterile quiet that was broken only by the rhythmic, artificial beep of a private medical monitor. Beneath the stark glow of the overhead LED strip, Jack Carter lay perfectly motionless, his body buried under crisp white linens, looking like a shattered monument to a fallen empire. To anyone watching from the doorway, he was nothing more than a brain-dead vegetable, a tragic casualty of a horrific car crash on Route 9 that had sent his armored sedan plunging over a steep embankment 18 days ago. The doctors had been meticulous in their grim prognosis, pointing to the severe spinal compression and deep neural inflammation as proof that the $11 billion titan of Carter Dynamics was permanently trapped inside a silent prison. For over a week, a steady stream of corporate elites, anxious board members, and high-priced specialists had stood at the foot of his bed, offering practiced sighs and murmuring empty condolences, completely convinced that the great Jack Carter would never speak, move, or command a room ever again. What none of them knew, what his beautiful fiancée Catherine Drake could not possibly fathom, was that Jack Carter heard every single syllable spoken in the dark. He wasn't just alive. He was fully awake, his mind running at the same relentless, predatory speed that had allowed him to build an empire from, say, single Detroit warehouse into a global technology juggernaut. The paralyzing crash had not been a tragic twist of fate, nor was his current vegetative state an act of medical helplessness. It was a cold, masterfully executed trap of his own design. Months prior, Jack had detected subtle, anomalous shifts within his company's offshore accounts and picked up the faint scent of a coup brewing in his own inner circle. When his intelligence team confirmed that the brake lines on his favorite vehicle had been deliberately tampered with, Jack didn't run to the authorities. Instead, he saw a rare, surgical opportunity to run a comprehensive stress test on every person who claimed to love him, using his background in high-speed tactical driving. He took the car out onto Route 9, deliberately controlled the crash to minimize life-threatening injuries while ensuring maximum visual destruction, and used his wealth to establish a state-of-the-art private medical suite right inside his mansion. For 9 grueling days, he had performed the ultimate act of stillness, suppressing every natural reflex, practicing the measured, heavy rhythm of a deeply unconscious man with the same iron discipline he once used to dismantle hostile takeovers in New York boardrooms. He had transformed his own body into a hidden sniper's nest, patiently waiting for the wolves to reveal their teeth. The wait ended at precisely 2 in the morning when the heavy oak door clicked open, and the faint, distinct click of designer heels echoed across the hardwood floor. Catherine Drake walked into the room, her immaculate posture radiating the quiet confidence of a woman who believed she had already won the lottery. She didn't rush to his side. She didn't weep. And she didn't offer a single prayer. Instead, she stood at the edge of the bed, her eyes scanning his slack face with a cold, transactional detachment that made her look more like a corporate liquidator than a grieving bride-to-be. Slowly, she leaned over the guardrail, her expensive French perfume filling his senses, and pressed her lips dangerously close to his ear. When she spoke, her voice wasn't a sob, but a chilling, razor-sharp whisper that sliced through the heavy silence of the room. Die faster. Jack, my lawyers are waiting. The words landed with the flat efficiency of a grocery list, devoid of any human warmth, revealing the monstrous ambition that had been hiding behind her brilliant smile for the past 2 years. Catherine smiled in the dark, completely satisfied with her performance, utterly unaware that she had just pulled the trigger on her own destruction. Behind his blank, unblinking stare, Jack's mind recorded the admission with absolute, terrifying clarity. The woman he had planned to share his life with had just confessed to his attempted murder, and as she straightened up and turned her back to him to check her reflection in the darkened window pane, Jack quietly initiated the countdown to her ruin. The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut behind Catherine S.'s initial departure before the master suite transformed from a sanctuary of recovery into a bustling command center for corporate piracy. Jack lay perfectly suspended in his self-imposed oblivion, his ears catching the distinctive, heavy thud of a leather document case being dropped onto the glass-topped table near the lounge area of the bedroom. The metallic slide of zippers and the rustle of high-grade bond paper cut through the sterile hum of the medical monitors, signaling the arrival of the wolves. Catherine returned less than an hour later, her footsteps accompanied by the heavier, measured stride of Preston Hale, the senior legal counsel for Carter Dynamics, whom Jack had personally hired 5 years ago, and Garrett Cole, a slick offshore financial architect known in the underground circuit for making massive movements of capital vanish into thin air, believing completely that the $11 billion titan in the bed was a brain-dead vegetable incapable of processing a single vibration of sound. They didn't even bother to lower their voices. They spoke with the flat, chilling efficiency of auctioneers dividing up a carcass, turning Jack's private quarters into a cold liquidation office. Catherine sat in the leather armchair just 3 feet from the bed, her expensive pen scratching aggressively against legal pads as she directed the pillaging of the empire Jack had built from a single Detroit warehouse. Every word dropped into the quiet room like a heavy stone into still water, and Jack cataloged each detail with the absolute precision of a digital ledger. He listened intently as Garrett Cole laid out the schematics for the first major financial strike. The first tranche went through at precisely 3 o'clock. Garrett murmured, his voice laced with the greasy satisfaction of a thief who had successfully bypassed a vault security system. Full amount, $41.8 million. There was a compliance flag on one of the sub-accounts in Delaware, but I managed to pull the funds before it triggered the system-wide alert. Catherine didn't even gasp at the mention of the staggering sum. She merely tapped her fingers on her knee, demanding to know the timeline for the second phase of the theft. Make it 48 hours. Garrett, she ordered coldly, her tone devoid of the warm, practiced affection she had used to win Jack's trust over the past 2 years. We need the remaining capital cleared and moved into the Luxembourg structures before the board coordinates a secondary audit. Jack processed the numbers silently, mapping the digital trail of his stolen wealth in his mind, filing away the exact routing structures they were using to bleed Carter Dynamics dry. The betrayal deepened as Preston Hale stepped closer to the foot of the bed, the rustle of his silk tie scraping against his collar as he unfolded a thick packet of legal documents. Jack heard the specific, terrifying phrases tumble from the lawyer's mouth. Power of attorney, medical proxy, and estate administration. He prepared these documents last year during the routine corporate restructuring. Catherine lied smoothly, her voice moving through the fabricated narrative with the flawless confidence of an actress who had memorized her script and believed in its absolute authority. Everything is technically in order, but to override the automated board blocks, we need a physical validation. Preston sighed, a sound of pure transactional exhaustion. We'll need these notarized immediately to freeze out any inquiries from his personal attorney, Bernard Holt. Preston noted, his fountain pen clicking open. I already have a compliant notary standing by in the administrative wing. Catherine replied without a second's hesitation, her voice tight and unyielding, lying beneath the sheets. Jack felt a wave of absolute, freezing clarity wash over him that had nothing to do with anger. She hadn't just seized an opportunity after his crash. She had planned the notary, the documents, and the financial timelines before he had even woken up from his initial surgeries. She may have very well planned the execution of the crash itself. By the time the late afternoon light began to fade into a gloomy twilight, the room grew thicker with the scent of raw, undisguised ambition. Lucas Carter, Jack's power-hungry stepbrother, arrived smelling faintly of bourbon and cheap corporate arrogance. Without Catherine in the immediate vicinity to keep him on a leash, Lucas was looser, rawer, and visibly sweating under the immense pressure of the crime. The Meridian Clause gives us exactly 60 days from the date of incapacitation, Catherine explained to Lucas, her voice dropping into a low, controlled register that Jack had heard her use when closing hostile business deals. Start counting. The moment the legal architecture locks into place permanently, the board will move on a succession protocol, and you will step into the executive chair as our puppet leader. Lucas paced the length of the room, his heavy steps vibrating through the floorboards and into the frame of Jack's bed. Are you sure the board votes are lined up? Catherine, Lucas asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and greed. If Reed Andrews or Bernard Holt gets a whiff of the asset diversion before the Thursday session, the whole proxy architecture collapses. Catherine merely laughed, a short mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Jack is furniture now. Lucas, she said with brutal indifference. He is a condition to be managed, not a person. By Thursday, we own the kingdom, and there is absolutely nothing his loyalists can do to stop the transfer. Jack lay perfectly still in the dark, absorbing the full harvest of their treachery, sharpening his cold fury into an unstoppable counteroffensive while the wolves proudly celebrated inside his fortress. The grandfather clock in the distant main foyer of the Carter estate struck midnight, its deep, melodic chimes echoing faintly through the thick, insulated walls of the master suite. The elite conspirators had long since vanished into the night, retreating to their luxury vehicles and high-priced hotels to toast to their impending fortune, leaving the dark bedroom thick with the lingering scent of expensive French perfume, spilled bourbon, and the heavy, invisible suffocations of total betrayal. In the quiet aftermath, the room reverted back to a high-tech mausoleum, illuminated only by the sterile, fluctuating heartbeat of the medical monitors and the pale moonlight filtering through a crack in the velvet drapes. Jack Carter lay completely suspended in the dark, his breath slow, shallow, and perfectly measured, executing the flawless rhythm of a deeply unconscious man with the unyielding discipline that defined his entire life. His ears, sharpened by days of sensory isolation, to the point where they could track the subtle movements of air in the room, caught a new sound vibrating from the service corridor. It was not the sharp, aggressive click of Catherine S. designer stiletto heels, nor was it the heavy, arrogant stride of the corporate lawyers. These steps were soft, unhurried, and perfectly balanced, carrying the distinct cadence of someone who had nowhere more important to be in the entire world than exactly here, inside the dark epicenter of his shattered life. The heavy oak door swung open with a quiet creak, and Lily Ford stepped into the room, pushing a wheeled cleaning cart filled with fresh linens, polishing cloths, and specialized medical disinfectants. She was a 28-year-old maid, hired by the estate's property manager months ago to maintain the private wing. A woman whose entire world existed completely outside the ruthless, transactional boundaries of Jack's multi-billion-dollar technology empire. She had paid her own way through nursing school in her early 20s, with grueling weekend diner shifts in rural Ohio, inheriting nothing but a stubborn, unyielding sense of human decency from her school teacher parents. To Catherine Drake and the rest of the predatory board members who frequented the mansion, Lily was completely invisible, a faceless ghost in a uniform whose only purpose was to erase their footprints and keep the marble floors gleaming. But to Jack, lying immobile beneath the white sheets, her arrival was a profound shift in the room's temperature. Lily did not look at the bed with the predatory evaluation of a vulture counting down the minutes until liquidation, nor did she approach him with the performative, theatrical grief that Catherine wore like a designer coat. She walked toward his bedside table with a quiet, grounded presence that was entirely real, her voice warm and calm without being clinical as she broke the heavy silence. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," she said softly, speaking to silent, motionless form with the gentle earnestness of someone who fully expected an answer, treating his terrifying stillness as a temporary condition rather than a permanent, inconvenient fact. Without waiting for a response that the rest of the world believed would never come, Lily set to work, moving around the bed with a steady, practiced efficiency that delivered genuine care rather than performing it for an audience. She didn't treat him like a brain-dead medical patient or a piece of expiring furniture. She treated him like a man who was still entirely present inside his own skin. Jack felt her hands, steady, warm, and remarkably careful, slide beneath his rigid shoulders to gently adjust his positioning. For 9 days, his body had been locked in an agonizing, unmoving stance, the real spinal compression and temporary nerve inflammation causing a dull, deep ache to radiate through his torso and legs. As she smoothed the heavy blankets and fluffed the pillows beneath his head, leaning over him with an unhurried tenderness, she stepped back and murmured, "There, that's better," saying it entirely for his sake, not her own. It was a simple, enormous revelation that sat heavily in Jack's chest. For 2 long years, he had surrounded himself with people who calculated every smile, every touch, and every conversation based on what they could extract from his massive net worth. He had built massive corporate walls and called it strategy, keeping the world at a careful distance, convinced that true vulnerability was a fatal flaw in a ruthless world. Yet here, in the darkest hour of his life, when he was stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his power, the lowest paid person in his household was the only one who cared whether he was comfortable. The only one who looked at him and still saw a person, lying perfectly slack. Jack felt the muscles behind his eyes ache with a profound, terrifying emotion he hadn't experienced since the night his mother died 14 years ago. After thoroughly cleaning the monitors and wiping down the bedside surfaces with meticulous care, Lily did something that shattered the remaining rules of the transactional world Jack had inhabited for 43 years. She pulled a worn, creased paperback book from the deep pocket of her apron, settled quietly into the heavy leather armchair beside his bed, and opened it to a marked page. She didn't ask for permission, nor did she look around the room to see if anyone was watching her break protocol. She simply cleared her throat softly and began to read aloud. The book was John Steinbeck's East of Eden, and as her unhurried, genuine voice filled the dim room. The words carried a natural, flowing rhythm that was completely untainted by deceit. The sound floated over the hum of the heart monitor, wrapping around Jack like a warm blanket. Instantly, the harsh reality of his current corporate war faded, pulled backward through time by the specific cadence of Steinbeck's prose. Jack found himself transported back 30 years, to a freezing winter in Detroit when he was just 17 years old, sitting in a corner of the public library because the heat in his tenement apartment building had been shut off by a neglectful landlord. He had sat in that warm library for hours, lost in a story about brothers, betrayal, and the agonizing, beautiful struggle of what it truly means to be known. He had not thought about that library or that boy in 3 decades, having buried his past beneath mountains of gold, concrete, and corporate steel. Lily read continuously for 40 minutes, her voice never wavering, offering him a priceless sanctuary of words simply because she refused to let him be marooned in the dark with nothing but the ghosts of his enemies. When she finally reached the end of the chapter, the soft rustle of the turning page stopped, and a gentle silence settled over the master suite once more. Lily closed the book with a soft click, resting her hands on the cover as she looked at Jack still, unblinking face with level, honest attention. A long pause stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. I'll be back tomorrow. Same time, if that's okay with you, she said quietly, her voice barely moving the air in the room. She stood up from the armchair, smoothing her uniform, and sighed softly as she prepared to push her cleaning cart back into the corridor. I know you might not be able to hear me, Mr. Carter, she murmured, pausing by the edge of the bed rail. But I figure silence isn't great company either way when you're fighting your way back. Jack lay perfectly frozen, but inside his chest, something fundamental had shifted. He had spent his entire life running a multi-billion-dollar empire on the cynical assumption that everyone operated out of pure self-interest. But Lily Ford had just shattered that philosophy without asking for a single thing in return. She was completely real in a room where everything else had been a calculated performance for 18 days. As her soft-soled shoes turned toward the door, Jack knew his hours of passive observation were over. The silent storm he had manufactured to test his enemies had just given him his greatest asset, and he was ready to begin his descent from the sniper's nest. The soft hum of the medical monitors felt heavier now, ticking away the seconds like a countdown in the deep, unyielding quiet of the master suite. Lily Ford stood by the edge of the bed rail for a long moment, her hand resting lightly on the cold metal, her eyes lingering on Jack Carter's face with a quiet, observant intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with a deep, instinctive protectiveness. She had spent 9 days walking into this room, washing away the traces of a conspiracy she could feel in the air but couldn't yet name. And every night, the absolute stillness of the man in the bed had sat heavily in her chest. She adjusted the strap of her canvas cleaning apron, taking a slow, quiet breath as she prepared to turn away and push her heavy service cart back out into the long, marble-lined corridors of the estate. To the rest of the household, Jack Carter was already a ghost, a fallen king whose kingdom was being carved up by vultures in the daylight. But to Lily, he was a soul marooned in a terrifyingly dark room, and she refused to leave him without at least offering a quiet anchor of human presence. She turned slowly, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished hardwood floor, her hand reaching for the black handle of the cleaning cart beneath the crisp white sheets, hidden entirely from the gaze of the security cameras and the treacherous eyes of his fiancée. Jack Carter was executing a monumentally agonizing sequence of mental calculations. His mind, running with the razor-sharp precision of a luxury engine, had spent the last 40 minutes anchoring itself to the genuine rhythm of Lily's voice as she read from the worn pages of East of Eden. He had analyzed every line of her face, every unhurried movement of her hands, and the absolute lack of performative theater in her demeanor, arriving at a conclusion that would alter the entire trajectory of his counteroffensive. Lily Ford was the single, unbought wildcard that Catherine Drake and her legal mercenaries had completely failed to model in their calculations if he was going to dismantle the $11 billion trap that had been laid for him. He needed an ally inside this house who wasn't on the corporate payroll. Someone who could carry a message past the perimeter Catherine had drawn around his body. The paralysis holding his limbs captive was fading, the real nerve inflammation from the controlled crash beginning to recede under the relentless force of his willpower. But producing a visible, deliberate movement required him to force a massive burst of concentration down through his compressed neural pathways, a grueling mental labor that felt like trying to ignite an engine underwater. Jack dilled his focus down into a single point, directing every ounce of his hoarded energy toward the tip of his right index finger, ignoring the white-hot flash of resistance that screamed through his locked neck and forearm. He could hear the faint, metallic rattle of the cleaning supplies as Lily's hand tightened on the cart handle, her body shifting weight as she prepared to step out into the hallway. With a final, explosive exertion of pure determination, Jack broke through the neural blockade, forcing his right index finger to press down firmly against the mattress, lifting it slightly, and pressing it down a second time. The twin movements were minute, barely shifting the heavy fabric of the linen sheets. A gesture so incredibly small that any ordinary observer or passing medical orderly would have instantly dismissed it as a reflexive twitch, random firing of dying synapses. But Lily Ford was not an ordinary observer. She was a woman whose entire professional life had been built on the quiet, meticulous tracking of a patient's silent indicators. And the deliberate, rhythmic nature of those two distinct taps struck her with the force of a physical blow. She froze instantly, her hand locking onto the handle of the cart, her breath hitching in her throat as the entire room went perfectly, suffocatingly still, slowly, without making a single sudden movement that might alert anyone watching the security feeds outside. Lily released her grip on the cleaning cart and turned back toward the bed, her face a mask of careful, calculated calm. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry out. And she didn't run to the door to summon the private medical staff or the guards Catherine had stationed at the estate gates. She simply stepped closer to the guardrail, her uniform rustling softly as she leaned over Jacka's motionless form. She looked down at his right hand, which lay open and slack at his side, and then she lifted her gaze to his eyes, searching the unblinking, frozen depth of his face with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through his performance of deep unconsciousness. When she spoke, her voice was barely a breath, a low, steady murmur that barely moved the air between them. The voice of someone choosing absolute calm deliberately because she understood intuitively that a single mistake in this room could cost both of them everything. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, her chest rising and falling in a tight rhythm. "If you can hear me, if that wasn't an accident." "Do that again." Jack heard the tremor of controlled adrenaline in her voice, but beneath it, he recognized the unyielding steel of her character, a stubbornness that her professors in nursing school had called either admirable or impossible, depending on the week. He gathered the remaining reserves of his energy, forcing his concentration back down the same burning neural pathway, and pressed his index finger down against the mattress a third time, holding it there for a full second before releasing it. Lily exhaled once, a long, slow release of tension that sounded like a prayer, her shoulders dropping as the sheer, enormous reality of the moment settled into her mind. She glanced quickly toward the darkened window pane and the subtle dome of the security camera in the far corner of the high ceiling. Then she leaned even closer to the bed, her face just inches from Jack's ear, her voice dropping into a register so quiet it was almost a secret. "I don't know what's happening in this house, Mr. Carter," she murmured, her honest eyes locked onto his profile. "But I've been watching Catherine and those lawyers for 9 days. And I don't think anything here is what it looks like on the surface. If you're choosing to stay quiet, if you have a reason to hide, I will keep your secret. I need you to know that you don't have to do this alone." The words sat heavily in Jack's chest, a profound and unfamiliar weight that felt somehow easier to carry than everything else he had been holding since the car left the mountain road on Route 9. For 43 years, he had operated under the assumption that every human interaction was a transaction, a chess match where players only protected you if your survival guaranteed their profit. But Lily Ford had just offered him total allegiance without knowing his bank balance, his reputation, or the dangerous list of enemies he carried. Jack pressed his finger down one final time, a single firm tap that wasn't an answer to a question, but a profound acknowledgement of a pact that didn't need words to be completely understood. Lily understood instantly, a faint, fleeting shadow of a smile touching the corner of her mouth before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Rest now, Mr. Carter," she said softly, her fingers gently smoothing the blanket over his shoulder in the same consistent gesture of kindness she offered every night. "I'll be back." She straightened up, took hold of her cleaning cart, and walked out into the corridor, her voice remaining perfectly steady and professional as she exchanged routine pleasantries with the night security guard outside, leaving Jack alone in the dark, no longer a prisoner in a trap, but a commander preparing to launch a war. The heavy gray mist of a Michigan late afternoon pressed hard against the towering, reinforced glass windows of the master suite, casting long, fractured shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The air inside the room remained thick and stagnant, holding the ghostly, unsettling resonance of the massive corporate coup that had been openly negotiated around Jack Carter's seemingly lifeless body just hours prior. Jack lay perfectly suspended beneath the crisp linen sheets, his respiratory pattern locked into a flawless, mechanical cadence that simulated a deep, unyielding vegetative state with absolute, terrifying precision. Every sensory organ he possessed was tuned to the maximum frequency, transforming his forced immovability into a hyper-focused radar. The distant, heavy click of the Mansion S biometric security locks echoed down the service wing, followed by a frantic, uncoordinated tread that lacked the cold, predatory rhythm of Catherine Drake or the slick, measured efficiency of the corporate attorneys. These steps were heavy, erratic, and uneven, vibrating through the structural beams of the estate until they crossed the threshold of the bedroom. Lucas Carter had arrived, and he was completely alone, without Catherine in the immediate vicinity to dictate his movements or keep his volatile ambition on a tight leash. The staggering weight of the conspiracy was visibly breaking the younger man apart. Jack could hear the rough, trembling hitch in Lucas's breath as he closed the heavy oak door with a sharp, unnecessary slam, the lock clicking into place with a definitive metallic snap. Lucas did not stand at a distance like the other corporate executioners. He dragged the heavy leather armchair directly to the bedside, the legs scraping aggressively against the floorboards with a screech that betrayed his absolute lack of composure. He dropped into the seat, his expensive wool suit rustling loudly as he buried his face in his hands, exhaling a long, ragged breath that reeked faintly of midday bourbon and raw, suffocating panic. For 30 long years, Lucas had lived as a bitter shadow in the background of Jack's historic ascent, nursing an unyielding, toxic resentment that had been easily weaponized by Catherine's brilliant, manipulative promises. But today, standing on the literal precipice of seizing the throne of an $11 billion empire, the reality of the crime was executing a brutal, psychological liquidation on his conscience. "I've spent 30 years in your shadow, Jack," Lucas said, his voice cutting through the sterile hum of the medical monitors with an edge that was anger, but something far rawer and more pathetic than anger. He leaned closer to the bed rail, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the cold metal, staring intensely at Jack's slack, unblinking face as if begging for a sign of resistance. 30 years of listening to you tell the board that Lucas is T-ready, that Lucas needs more time, that let us wait and see what the kid can handle. You said those things straight to my face, Jack, and you actually thought they were kindnesses. You thought you were protecting me from the wolves, but you weren't. You were just keeping me under your heel so you could play the omnipotent savior. He paused, his breathing turning ragged, his throat working visibly as he swallowed down the bitter pool of his own regrets. I wanted the company, Jack. I wanted the respect, the titles, the power to make men look at me the way they looked at you for 2 decades. I wanted the seat at the head of the table. And when Catherine came to me with the Meridian Clause, when she showed me the structural loopholes that could freeze you out legally, I took the bait because it was the only window I was ever going to get voluntarily. He stood up abruptly, the leather of the armchair groaning as he began to pace the length of the room, his heavy steps tracking a frantic, circular path beneath the dome of the security camera. But this isn't what I signed up for, Lucas whispered, his voice dropping into a rough, terrified rasp that barely carried over the mechanical beep of the heart monitor. He stopped pacing and turned back to the bed, his jaw working violently, his eyes wild with the specific, chaotic panic of a man who realized he had walked straight into a slaughterhouse while chasing a crown. He took 3 frantic steps back toward the bedside, leaning over the guardrail until his frantic breath fanned Jack's face. Didn't know about the carjacking, Jack. The brake line. Crash on Route 9. That wasn't me. I need you to know that, even if your mind is completely gone. I need you to hear me say it. His voice cracked violently on the last syllable, the raw terror leaking out completely undisguised. Marcus had 3 kids, Jack. 3 kids who used to play in the courtyard while he waited for you to finish your late-night strategy sessions. I am a schemer, an opportunist, a bastard who wanted your chair, but I am not a murderer. I would never have agreed to put a dead man's blood on my hands just to bypass a board vote, lying perfectly frozen in the dark. Jack processed those 9 words that wasn't me. I didn't know about the car with the cold, surgical precision that had become his primary mode of survival. He analyzed the specific frequency of Lucas's panic, recognizing the boy Gann had grown up with in Detroit before corporate ambition had sanded away the recognizable parts of his humanity. Jack knew his stepbrother completely. Lucas was a man who desperately needed to be believed, even in the absolute middle of his worst choices. Someone who required a definitive moral line he hadn't crossed so he could sleep at night. Lucas was telling the absolute truth, which meant the structural architecture of the conspiracies had a massive, fatal fault line running right down its center. Catherine Drake had manufactured the horrific accident alone, acting as a lone wolf executioner while using Lucas as an unwitting puppet to make the subsequent corporate succession look like a broader, family-backed transition. The realization shifted the entire landscape of the war. Catherine S. Coalition wasn't a solid concrete fortress, it was a brittle glass structure. And Lucas was already fracturing under the pressure. Lucas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand, stepping away from the bed as if the silent form lying there was burning him. She's downstairs right now with Preston Hale and the legal team, finalizing the documents for Thursday's emergency board session. Lucas muttered, his eyes darting toward the closed door, as if terrified Catherine would appear through the wood. Something is happening out there. Jack. Garrett Cole called her 20 minutes ago, and she went completely white. I've never seen her look like that in my life. There's a leak somewhere. Someone is digging into the offshore accounts, and she is getting desperate. And when Catherine gets desperate, she gets dangerous. I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life cleaning up her disaster or waiting for a federal indictment to land on my desk. He backed toward the door, his hand reaching out blindly for the brass handle, his chest heaving as he took a final, long look at Jack's motionless profile. Get better, Jack, Lucas said, his voice rough, hollowed out by an absolute exhaustion that cut past corporate strategy entirely. I mean that. Just get better. He turned the handle, slipped through the narrow opening, and clicked the door shut behind him, leaving the master suite plunged back into an immense, electrifying silence. Jack lay perfectly still in the fading light, his right index finger twitching once against the mattress, not in weakness, but in absolute lethal readiness as the first domino in his trap began to tilt toward the earth. The clock in the grand hallway downstairs had long since chimed midnight, plunging the sprawling Carter estate into a deep, suffocating darkness that felt heavy with the scent of unpunished crimes. Inside the massive master suite, the only light emanated from the pale moon, cutting through the velvet curtains and the sterile green luminescence of the biometric heart monitors. Jack Carter lay perfectly rigid beneath his crisp linen sheets, his respiratory patterns matching the slow, rhythmic cadence of a deeply comatose patient with a terrifying level of precision. Every cell in his brain was fired up, operating at the absolute peak of its predatory intelligence as he processed the psychological collapse his stepbrother, Lucas, had exhibited just hours prior. The enemy's fortress was fracturing from within, but Jack knew that passive observation had reached its expiration date. The final board deadline was scheduled for Thursday, and if he did not establish a line of communication with the outside world immediately, Catherine's manufactured legal architecture would lock into place permanently. He needed to strike, and he needed to strike with surgical precision. At precisely 1 a.m, the heavy brass handle of the bedroom door turned with a faint, almost imperceptible click. Lily Ford slipped into the dark room, but tonight, she carried no heavy cleaning supplies or polishing cloths. Instead, tucked tightly beneath her arm was a small, laminated letterboard typically reserved for nonverbal patient communication, alongside a thick legal notepad and a sharpened pencil. She moved across the room with the fluid, unhurried grace of a phantom, her soft sole shoes making absolutely no sound against the polished hardwood floor. Lily walked directly to the head of the bed, immediately positioning her slender body at a precise angle to completely block the narrow glass panel of the door, shielding Jack's form from any roaming security guards or hidden camera lenses. When she leaned down over the guardrail, her voice was barely a breath, a low vibration of air that didn't even register on the room's ambient audio monitors. Been thinking about how to do this properly, Mr. Carter, she whispered, her honest eyes scanning his frozen face. We have exactly 30 minutes before the corridor security rotation changes. Can you work with the board? Jack didn't hesitate. Gathering every reserve of hoarded neural energy he had painstakingly protected over 9 days of forced immobility, he forced his right index finger to press down firmly against the mattress a single time. Yes, Lily nodded once, her expression hardening into the fierce, stubborn determination of a woman who had decided to stand between a trapped man and his executioners. She slid the laminated board beneath his open palm, aligning the grid of printed letters with the stiff, recovering tip of his finger. The physical toll was instantaneous and immense. Each movement felt like forcing a current of electricity through frozen, rusted steel pipes. But Jack pushed past the agonizing resistance with the iron discipline that had built Carter Dynamics. Slowly, deliberately, his finger began to track across the smooth plastic surface, pausing on specific coordinates as Lily tracked the tiny twitches with meticulous care. her pencil moving silently across the legal pad in a tight, neat script. REIDANDREWS. Lily read the letters back in a rhythmic, barely audible murmur, her brow furrowing slightly as she deciphered the name. Reed Andrews, she whispered, looking up to meet his clear, intense gaze. A person. Jack pressed his finger down once. Yes. You want me to call him? Another single. Firm press. Yes. Lily lowered her pencil back to the paper, holding the board steady as Jack's finger began to move again, dragging through the numbers of a highly encrypted personal cell phone line. She took down the 10 digits one by one, repeating them back in a ghost of a whisper to ensure perfect accuracy before looking back down at his face. What do I tell him? Mr. Carter, she asked, her pencil poised over the blank line. Jack closed his eyes for a fraction of a second to concentrate his remaining energy, then forced his hand back onto the board, spelling out the ancient, definitive wartime phrase TEL, LHI, MJA, CKS, AWT, HES, TOR, MCO, MIN. G. Lily read the phrase silently, her lips tracing the letters without making a sound. Before looking up into his unblinking eyes, she didn't ask what it meant. She didn't demand an explanation for the strange, ominous riddle. She simply recognized the absolute strategic importance of the words. He'll know what it means, she stated, her voice holding the calm certainty of a professional nurse who understood that exact execution mattered more than curiosity. Jack pressed once. Yes, Lily folded the legal pad with a swift, clean motion, tucking it deep into the pocket of her uniform along with the pencil. Pulled the letterboard back beneath her arm. She stood up straight, smoothing the linen sheets over his chest with the same consistent, unhurried kindness she delivered every single night. Pausing by the door, she transitioned back into her ordinary, professional caretaker voice loud enough to satisfy any listening devices. Good night, Mr. Carter! Rest well. The heavy oak door closed soft and fast, leaving Jack alone in the dark. For the first time since his car had left the mountain road on Route 9, he felt a massive, tectonic shift occur within his chest. The specific, terrifying sensation of being a trapped animal was dissolving, replaced by the lethal clarity of a launcher preparing to fire. Catherine Drake had systematically controlled every variable inside his mansion, but she had completely failed to model the unbought soul of Lily Ford. And that single blind spot was going to cost her everything. Exactly 30 minutes later, standing in the freezing, concrete shadows of the estate's underground parking structure, Lily leaned against the cold brick wall and pulled out her personal cell phone. She dialed the 10-digit number from memory, her breath plumbing in the winter air as the line began to ring. Across town, in a darkened kitchen lit only by the amber glow of a single desk lamp, Reed Andrews was drowning in cold coffee and absolute exhaustion. He had not slept in 18 days. Having been brutally turned away from the hospital perimeter by Catherine herself on the night of the crash. He had called Jack's direct line 14 times, only to hit Catherine S. filtered voicemail. And his recent call to Jack S. estate attorney, Bernard Holt, had yielded nothing but tight, legally bound neutrality. Reed was staring at a legal pad covered in dead-end corporate notes when his personal phone lit up with an unknown number at precisely 12:47 a.m. He answered it on the first ring, his voice rough with suspicion. Andrews, he rasped. Mr. Andrews? The voice on the other end was young, female, and utterly composed, carrying the specific, distinct calm of a professional who had chosen composure rather than found it naturally. My name is Lily Ford. I am a maid at the Carter estate, and I am calling you from a personal device in a secure location. I need you to listen very carefully and not repeat a single syllable I say until we have verified our protocol. Reed set his pen down slowly, his corporate defense mechanisms instantly locking into place. Go ahead, he commanded, his posture straightening. Lily took a single, quiet breath over the line. I have a direct message for you from Jack Carter. The entire kitchen went completely, violently silent. Reed stood up from his chair before his conscious mind could even transmit the motor instruction to his legs. Say that again, he ordered, his hand gripping the phone with white-knuckled intensity. Lily didn't falter. Jack asked me to tell you. Jack saw the storm coming. Reed's fingers closed so hard around the phone casing that the plastic groaned. That exact. Specific phrase existed in only one sacred place in the entire world, a freezing parking garage in Detroit 24 years ago. After a corrupt business partner had tried to incinerate everything they had built before Jack systematically dismantled the man's entire life in a single afternoon. They had never used the words again, because they had never needed to. He's conscious. Reed whispered into the dark kitchen, his voice shaking with an enormous, sudden surge of adrenaline. He has limited motor function in his right hand, communicating entirely through finger movements and a letterboard. Lily explained quickly, her voice tight and efficient. He is fully alert, fully functional, and he has heard every single conversation inside his quarters for 9 days. 9 days, Reed thought, closing his eyes as a wave of fierce, cold calculation washed through him. 9 days of Catherine Drake walking through his house like she owned the kingdom, while Jack lay there like a silent hard drive, recording every name, every routing number, and every transaction. The trap had completely flipped, and the true master of Carter dynamics was finally ready to play his hand. The deep, suffocating darkness of the mansion's upper wing began to dissolve into a pale, ash-gray dawn as the clock struck 3 in the morning. Jack Carter lay perfectly suspended beneath his sheets, his breathing locked into the slow, mechanical cadence of a deeply comatose patient, while his mind operated with the chilling efficiency of a predatory mainframe. Every sensory nerve was strained to its maximum limit, monitoring the quietest vibrations traveling through the heavy oak door of the master suite. The silence was shattered by the frantic, echoing stride of Preston Hale rushing down the corridor, his footsteps lacking his usual slick, arrogant rhythm. The lawyer stopped just outside the bedroom door, the rustle of his heavy wool coat scraping against the molding as he frantically dialed a number on his encrypted cell phone. Believing the corridor was completely deserted and that the man inside the room was nothing more than an expensive piece of dying furniture, Preston didn't even bother to lower his voice. He spoke in a strained, frantic rasp that cut straight through the wood, his words landing with the force of a sudden, violent shift in the wind. The Andrews issue needs to be contained before the morning session, Preston whispered harshly into the receiver, his hand tapping erratically against the doorframe. If he gets the account documentation to the SEC before Thursday, the Cayman freeze becomes permanent. The power of attorney we filed is only as strong as the legal framework supporting it. And if Andrews can establish any form of responsiveness or cognitive awareness within the first 72 hours of the crash, the whole proxy architecture collapses entirely. Tell Catherine we need a final decision by 6 a.m. We either push the signature timeline forward immediately, or we cut Garrett loose to protect the primary transfers. We cannot hold both lines under this kind of federal pressure. The call ended with a sharp, aggressive click, and Preston's heavy footsteps retreated down the marble hall, leaving the master suite plunged back into an immense, electrifying quiet. Jack processed the intercepted data with cold, absolute clarity. 3 massive variables had just shifted in his favor. Reed Andrews was moving with terrifying speed. The fraudulent power of attorney was legally fragile, and Catherine was about to be forced into an impossible choice that would inevitably unravel her entire coalition. The critical problem facing Jack was the ticking clock. Preston's 6 a.m. deadline was rapidly approaching, and Lily Ford's regular shift wasn't scheduled to begin until noon. He needed to get this vital data to Reed immediately, but forcing his recovering nerves to produce another visible movement required a brutal, exhausting expenditure of his hoarded willpower. Jack focused his concentration into a single, burning point, directing the current down his damaged neural pathways toward his right arm, ignoring the white-hot flashes of agony that screamed through his locked neck and shoulder. It took 40 long, agonizing minutes of silent labor before his trembling palm finally grazed the edge of the medical call button clipped to the bed rail, triggering the silent alert in the staff quarters. The night nurse who answered the page, however, was a tired, detached contract worker who merely checked his vital monitors, noted the activation as a probable involuntary muscle spasm, and left without a second glance. Jack felt the physical loss of those 40 minutes like a heavy blow. The ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs, growing louder as the window of opportunity began to slam shut. At precisely 5:47 a.m., the heavy brass handle of the door turned with a quiet, unexpected click, and Lily Ford slipped into the room. She was running on less than 2 hours of sleep, her face pale with exhaustion, but her honest eyes burning with an unyielding, Professional determination. She had bypassed the main security checkpoint by using the staff service entrance, carrying her laminated letterboard tucked tightly under her arm. I couldn't sleep. "Mr. Carter!" she whispered, her voice barely moving the air as she crossed the room and instantly positioned her body to block the door's glass panel from the hallway view. Reed called my personal cell at 4 o'clock. He said if you have anything urgent, he needs it before the 6 a.m. deadline. Jack didn't waste a single second. He forced his right hand onto the smooth plastic of the board, his index finger dragging through the letters with a frantic, desperate precision as Lily tracked each coordinate and scribbled the characters onto her notepad. PRESTO, NHA, LE3, AMC, ALL, POA, SHA, KYN, EED, 7, 2H, OUR, PRO.O, F. Lily read the transcribed's message back in a ghost of a whisper, her eyes widening as she realized the immense legal leverage Jack had just handed them. She immediately pulled out her personal phone, dialing Reed Andrews on a prearranged, secure channel while keeping her eyes locked onto the master suite door. Reed answered on the first ring, his kitchen table covered in fresh legal pads as Lily relayed the details of Preston S. call, the looming 6 a.m. deadline, and the critical 72-hour responsiveness window. Reed was silent for 4 long seconds, the heavy sound of his breathing carrying over the encrypted line before he spoke with the cold, lethal certainty of a veteran corporate assassin. "Tell Jack I already have the 72-hour proof," Reed commanded, his voice tight with triumph. "I reviewed the medical logs last night. Dr. Okafor documented elevated stress responses and localized neural spikes in the first 48 hours after the crash data that is entirely inconsistent with a vegetative state. I had a federal neurologist review the chart at midnight, and she is prepared to testify before Judge Chen this morning. Tell him Catherine's window just closed." Lily lowered the phone and repeated Reed's words to Jack, her voice low and steady as she watched the profound, silent relief settle behind his unblinking eyes. Jack pressed his finger against the mattress once, yes, before dragging his hand back onto the letterboard to deliver the fatal strike against the enemy's fracturing line. O-N-E-M. THI-NGL, UCA, SIS, BRE, AKI, NGU, SEH. I am Lily relayed the directive to Reed, who responded instantly without a second of hesitation. "Tell Jack that Lucas came to my private office at 11 last night," Reed whispered, a grim satisfaction cutting through his exhaustion. "The kid is terrified. He wants a non-prosecution deal in exchange for turning over the original Meridian emails. Tell Jack to set aside whatever he's feeling about his stepbrother. Until Thursday, I need Lucas functional and cooperative to break Catherine's board majority." Lily hung up the phone, carefully hiding her notes in her apron pocket, and looked down at Jack with a level, deeply respectful attention. "He's right. Mr. Carter," she murmured, gently smoothing the linen sheets over his trembling shoulder. "The trap is locked. Now, you need to rest." Jack tapped his finger a final time in silent gratitude, the master suite falling back into a tense, quiet waiting as the first rays of daylight began to hit the velvet drapes. The afternoon sun of mid-June had burned away the morning mist, casting long, sharp beams of amber light through the towering, reinforced glass windows of the master suite. It was precisely 2:15 p.m. when the heavy biometric locks on the oak door clicked open with a definitive, chilling sound. Jack Carter lay completely suspended beneath his crisp white linens, his respiratory pattern mimicking the slow, heavy cadence of a deeply comatose patient with flawless, predatory precision. Every sensory organ he possessed was operating at a lethal frequency, recording the sudden, calculated shift in the room's atmosphere as multiple sets of footsteps crossed the threshold. Catherine Drake entered first, her expensive French perfume cutting through the stagnant, clinical scent of the room like a physical warning. Behind her came the sharp, measured stride of Preston Hale, and bringing up the rear was a man Jack didn't immediately recognize, a gray-suited professional with a heavy leather document case and the studied, icy neutrality of a professional witness. Catherine had brought the notary back into his room for the final execution of her coup. The silence of the room grew suffocating as the three figures assembled around the bed, like executioners preparing to divide a fallen kingdom. Catherine sat smoothly in the leather armchair just 3 feet from Jack's seemingly lifeless form, while Preston Hale positioned himself with rigid authority at the foot of the bed rail. The anonymous notary stood near the heavy oak door, his leather case resting on the glass-top table as he pulled out a thick packet of legal documents designed to seal Jack's fate permanently. Catherine leaned forward, her immaculate, composed facade radiating the quiet confidence of a thief who believed she had already erased every trace of her crime. When she spoke, she used her soft, practiced voice, the beautiful, deceptive melody that had successfully exploited Jack's deepest vulnerabilities for 2 long years because he had desperately wanted to believe in it. "Jack," she murmured smoothly, her elegant hand reaching out to touch his arm with a theatrical tenderness that was entirely for the benefit of the notary standing by the door. "I need you to hear me. Darling, whatever happens next, I want you to know that everything I've done has been to protect the magnificent empire you built. The lawyers just need one final thing to keep the company safe, a handprint. The medical proxy statute allows reflexive hand movement as legal assent given your current condition. Just one simple touch." Catherine whispered, her voice tight with suppressed greed. "That's all it takes." Preston Hale stepped forward instantly, his face devoid of any human emotion as he unwrapped the thick legal bond paper and placed the smooth, ink-lined page directly against Jack's flaccid right hand. Jack stared blankly at the ceiling, analyzing the precise mechanism of the trap with the same cold, tactical intelligence that had built Carter Dynamics from a single Detroit warehouse into an $11 billion juggernaut. He understood the legal gray area they were exploiting. They had brought a corrupt professional witness into his private quarters to interpret a forced, involuntary muscle spasm as full, legally binding consent to strip him of his life's work. Catherine was standing barely 3 feet from total victory, her hand tightening on his wrist, entirely unaware that the man she had dismissively managed as furniture was about to pull the rug out from under her entire existence. Jack had spent 18 grueling days hoarding his neural energy, silently training every damaged pathway and testing his concentration to the absolute limit for this exact, definitive microsecond. His neck muscles screamed with a sudden, white-hot rush of adrenaline, and his vision swam with a flash of pure energy as he broke through the remaining resistance of his spinal compression. With a massive, explosive exertion of unyielding willpower, Jack Carter executed his masterstroke. He turned his head fully and deliberately, his first major voluntary movement in nearly 3 weeks, and his eyes snapped open, clear, wholly alert, and terrifyingly cold as they locked onto Catherine Drake's face. The entire room stopped breathing instantly, the green line of the heart monitor spiking violently as the sheer physical reality of the moment shattered the conspirators' confidence. Catherine's expression cycled through 5 distinct stages of horror in less than 2 seconds. Utter confusion, violent recalibration, and finally the stark, paralyzing terror of a strategist watching a structure they believed solid dissolve into thin air. Preston Hale took a frantic step backward, his fountain pen slipping from his numb fingers, while the gray-suited notary made a choked, terrified sound that wasn't a word. Jack looked at his fiancée the exact way he had looked at rival CEOs across boardroom tables for 2 decades, steady, unhurried, and absolute. When his voice came out, it was wrecked and thinned by 18 days of forced silence, rough and low like a controlled, gravelly rasp. But every single syllable landed with the precision of a physical blow. "Drop the document," Jack commanded, his icy gaze pinning her to the floor. "Get the hell out of my room." Catherine sat frozen for 3 full seconds, her mind desperately cycling through her remaining plays, her eyes darting frantically across his alert form to see if there was still an angle, a hidden loophole, or a final maneuver left to save her skin. There wasn't, and the crushing realization passed across her beautiful face like a dark shadow crossing a winter field. "Jack!" she stammered, her voice cracking as her perfect composure evaporated entirely. "I said, get out." Jack rasped again, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Preston Hale's hand was already on Catherine's arm, violently pulling her toward the exit with the frantic instinct of a high-priced lawyer who recognized the exact microsecond a room had transitioned from a corporate asset into a catastrophic federal liability. The notary was already gone, having fled into the corridor without collecting his leather document case. Catherine stopped for a single fraction of a second in the open doorway, turning back to look at the man who had completely outmaneuvered her from a bed of paralysis. Her face had gone quiet, not the fake, performed quiet of her devoted fiancé role, but the real, hard, freezing quiet of a ruthless woman standing at the absolute, cataclysmic end of something. I would have run it well, she whispered with a chilling, desperate pride, staring at the empire she had almost stolen. I want you to know that, Jack, I would have actually run it well. Jack held her gaze with absolute, unyielding coldness. You'll have plenty of time to think about that, he said, his voice dropping into a lethal whisper. From wherever the feds end up putting you. The door slammed shut, and the heavy architecture of her treachery collapsed into the quiet room. The heavy iron gates of the federal field office had barely closed behind Catherine Drake's escorted form before Jack Carter turned his attention to the only debt that truly mattered to him. 3 weeks after the chaotic collapse of the conspiracy, the official indictments had been finalized by the district attorney's office, locking Catherine, Preston Hale, and Garrett Cole into a flawless legal vice built on wire fraud, securities manipulation, and conspiracy to commit murder. Yet, as the financial world erupted with news of the thwarted coup and the dramatic stabilization of Carter Dynamics, Jack did not remain in the high-tech sanctuary of his mansion to celebrate his victory. He refused the endless requests for media interviews and ignored the frantic calls from his board members, choosing instead to step into a black armored sedan driven by a security detail he had personally vetted through Reed Andrews. He directed the car away from the affluent suburbs and toward a quiet, faded blue-collar neighborhood on the rugged outskirts of Detroit, the very city where he had grown up and where he had first learned that every choice carries a definitive, unyielding cost. The car pulled up to a modest, immaculate two-story home where the small porch light cast a warm, defiant glow against the gathering twilight. Jack stepped out of the vehicle carefully, his left leg dragging slightly, a lingering reminder of the real spinal compression that Dr. Okafor insisted would require months of rigorous physical therapy to completely erase. He ignored the dull ache in his torso, refusing the assistance of his guards as he walked up the concrete steps and knocked firmly on the worn oak door. When Elena Chin opened it, her eyes red-rimmed with a profound, suffocating grief that no corporate settlement could ever alleviate, Jack didn't offer her a sterile legal folder or an apologetic corporate speech. He simply removed his coat, stepped into the small kitchen that smelled faintly of spices and old wood, and sat down at the worn laminate table. For 11 long years, Marcus Chin had been more than just his personal driver. He had been the quiet, unshakable anchor in Jack's highly volatile existence. A man who possessed a rare, comfortable silence that could turn a tense, multi-million-dollar midnight drive into a sanctuary of absolute safety. For 4 uninterrupted hours, the billionaire tycoon sat in that quiet kitchen and did something he hadn't done in decades. He listened without an agenda and spoke completely from his heart. He didn't talk about the federal asset recovery, the Cayman Island account freezes, or the forensic accounting reports that Reed had successfully processed earlier that morning. Instead, he shared vivid stories of Marcus with Elena and her 3 children, recalling the specific, stubborn pride with which Marcus always refused the extra Christmas bonus envelopes, and the gentle, protective way he watched over the estate courtyard while waiting for late-night strategy sessions to conclude. As the hours slipped away, the heavy, suffocating tension in the room began to soften into a space of shared remembrance. Sometime during the second hour, Marcus's youngest child, a 4-year-old girl with her father's intense, quiet eyes, crept across the linoleum floor, climbed directly into Jack's lap, and fell fast asleep, her small hand curling into the fabric of his expensive shirt. Jack sat perfectly, unyieldingly still, refusing to adjust his position despite the growing stiffness in his recovering nerves, because he understood intuitively that some boundaries are sacred and some discomforts are a privilege to bear. When he finally rose to leave as midnight approached, Jack looked directly into Elena's exhausted, resilient face and delivered a quiet, immutable vow that outlasted any corporate contract or public relations statement. He assured her, in a voice heavy with absolute certainty, that as long as Carter Dynamics existed, and as long as he drew breath, her family would be protected, her children's educations would be completely funded, and their home would remain a fortress against the world. He didn't offer the massive trust funds as an act of charity or an attempt to purchase his own forgiveness. He offered it because he had accepted the brutal, irreducible weight of his own survival. Marcus had paid the ultimate, permanent price for a trap that had been laid specifically for Jack. Dying on that mountain road because Jack had foolishly trusted a wolf in a designer dress. As he walked back down the porch steps into the freezing November night air, the deep ache in his chest was no longer driven by the sting of Catherine's betrayal. It was the heavy, honorable weight of a blood debt that could never be truly paid, only honored imperfectly for the rest of the time he had left on the earth. The sharp, freezing sting of the November air did not pierce Jack Carter's chest as he stepped out of his armored sedan. Instead, it felt like the first clean breath of a man who had finally surfaced after drowning in a sea of his own making. There were no luxury escorts trailing behind him tonight, no high-priced corporate bodyguards scanning the perimeter, and no frantic board members buzzing his encrypted cell phone with urgent tactical demands. He walked up the narrow concrete steps of the modest suburban apartment building, entirely under his own power, his left hand lightly trailing the cold metal of the handrail to steady the slight, stubborn drag in his left leg. Dr. Okafor had explicitly warned him that attempting to bypass the strict 6 to 8 week physical therapy timeline was an act of sheer, offensive arrogance. But Jack had compressed the schedule out of pure, unyielding willpower. He stopped at the second floor landing, took a slow, deliberate breath to settle the sudden tremor in his recovering nerves, and knocked firmly on the wooden door of apartment 2B. When Lily Ford opened the door, she wasn't wearing the crisp, invisible uniform of a maid or the clinical protection of a hospital rotation. She was dressed in a simple, oversized sweater, her hair pulled back loosely, radiating the same quiet, grounded reality that had kept Jack anchored to his own humanity during his darkest hours. Her small apartment was exceptionally warm and meticulously organized, holding the practical tidiness of someone who treated what little space she owned with genuine respect. She didn't look at him with the strategic evaluation of a corporate board member calculating his net worth, nor did she adopt a performative mask of deference. She simply looked at him standing vertical on her welcome mat, a slight, honest smile touching the corners of her mouth as she stepped aside to let him enter. Jack walked into the living room and placed a bottle of wine he had carefully chosen himself alongside a classic hardcover book onto her kitchen counter, feeling the sudden, unfamiliar sensation of arriving somewhere entirely as himself, completely stripped of the heavy, habitual armor he had worn like a shroud for 43 long years. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table, sharing a simple, home-cooked meal that Lily had prepared without a single ounce of pretentious theater. For 4 uninterrupted hours, the conversation flowed with a natural, unhurried rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate takeovers, federal indictments, or the chaotic restructuring of Carter dynamics. They talked about what it was like to grow up surrounded by the hard grit of Detroit, the sprawling, quiet fields of rural Ohio, and the particular, suffocating shape that loneliness takes when you have surrounded yourself with so many transactional relationships that you stop noticing the void. Jack listened to her with a level of intense, respectful attention he had never granted another living soul. Realization washing over him that her blunt, unbought sincerity was the rarest and most durable force he had ever encountered in his entire life. When he finally rose from the table to prepare for his departure, he walked to the doorway, turned to face her directly, and looked into her honest eyes without a single layer of professional warmth or strategic distance. "I told you I'd say it standing up," Jack said softly, his gravelly voice holding a depth of emotion that defied his usual corporate vocabulary. "I have spent my entire life in rooms full of highly educated people who were constantly calculating what they could extract from my proximity, and I had completely stopped believing that a person like you actually existed. You held a letterboard for a paralyzed man in a dark room, risking your own position to protect a total stranger before you knew a single thing about his reputation, his bank balance, or his empire. You reminded me of what is actually real." Lily was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands before lifting her gaze back to meet his with a characteristic level directness. "I drive a 7-year-old Honda, Jack, and my idea of a good evening is a decent book and quiet boundaries," she said firmly, her voice warm but entirely unyielding. "I am not going to become a different kind of person just because of who you are." Jack felt a genuine, unforced smile touch his face for the first time in years. "I know," he replied softly, his heart lifting. "That's the entire point. He stepped out of the apartment building and into the crisp, biting night air, walking down the concrete steps toward his waiting vehicle with a firm, balanced stride. He paused by the driver's side door, leaning his head back to look up at the single illuminated window of apartment 2B, watching her silhouette move briefly against the warm light inside before she drew the curtains. For 43 years, Jack Carter had built massive concrete walls and called them strategy, keeping the world at a safe distance while running an empire of 40,000 people with fewer than 3 individuals he could truly trust. He had spent his entire life obsessing over the next move, the next acquisition, and the next threat. But tonight, as he slipped behind the wheel and started the engine, his mind was entirely quiet. He wasn't thinking about tomorrow, S-Board ratification, the transition timeline with Lucas, or the looming criminal trials. He was thinking about right now this cold November night, this beautiful, unforgiving city, and the irreplaceable gift of a life that had been saved by a person who didn't want a single thing from him except his survival. He gripped the steering wheel, a profound, unyielding determination settling into his chest as he made the most ambitious, terrifyingly vulnerable plan of his entire career. He was going to dismantle the fortress, step out of the shadows of his own power, and finally learn how to be a real human being. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances. In the high-stakes world of absolute power, we are taught to build walls. We are taught that wealth is the ultimate fortress, that suspicion is a virtue, and that every human relationship is merely a chess match where players are moved according to what they can yield for your bottom line. We call it strategy. For decades, Jack Carter operated on this very philosophy, ruling an $11 billion empire under the cynical assumption that everyone carries a price tag. But when his world collapsed on Route 9, his manufactured crisis turned his private quarters into a cold, brutal laboratory of human nature. And what did that laboratory reveal? It proved a heavy, unyielding truth that every true boss must eventually learn in the dark. The structures we build out of money and fear are completely hollow. The elites he brought to his inner circle, his glamorous fiancée, his high-priced lawyers, and his own flesh and blood were nothing but transactional vultures. They didn't love the man, they worshipped the throne. They performed devotion in the daylight, but the second they thought the king was dead, they began carving up his carcass with the flat efficiency of a grocery list. Their loyalty lasted exactly as long as his bank balance was accessible. This is the ultimate danger of success surrounding yourself with so much performative warmth that you become blind to the profound isolation of your own position. But the true genius of this story, and its most profound moral lesson, lies in the complete inversion of social status. The entire $11 billion coup was not dismantled by an army of mercenaries or a team of brilliant corporate fixers. It was dismantled by a 28-year-old maid who earned a minimum wage. Lily Ford entered that room entirely devoid of an agenda. She didn't know Jack's net worth, his underworld reputation, or his list of enemies. She cared for him simply because she recognized a human soul stranded in a terrifyingly silent room. This brings us to the core ethical takeaway of the narrative. Character is defined entirely by how you treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for you. In a world driven by greed, pure, unprompted empathy is the rarest and most volatile currency in existence. Lily's unbought allegiance proved that real loyalty cannot be bartered, negotiated, or coerced. It is a direct consequence of mutual respect and human sincerity. Ultimately, Jack Carter's simulated Coma was meant to be a tactical stress test for his enemies, but it ended up becoming a spiritual awakening for himself. He reclaimed his empire, but he walked away with something infinitely more valuable: his humanity. He realized that the most ambitious plan a leader can ever make is not to double his net worth or crush his rivals, but to step out from behind the armor of his power and learn how to be a real person. Because at the end of the day, true power isn't about how many people fear your name, it's about having a single, Authentic souls who will stand by you in the dark when the rest of the world thinks you are finished.